For 20 years, she warmed that clay mug before the sun thought of warmth. The mug had a hairline crack down one side where a dropped pan once kissed the kitchen floor. The crack caught the light of morning and held it like a tiny river. Rosa Hernandez cupped the mug between hands that had learned the geometry of labor, the long, flat planes of palms rubbed by lemon, the quick, sure fingers that tied knots in sacks and mended hems, the thumbs that could tell a good stitch from a bad thread without looking. She lifted the steam to her face and let it fog for a moment, closing her eyes as if anticipating a prayer that had never needed words. She was a mother in the way the house needed mothers, waking before everyone to lay out clean sheets and a pot of black coffee, smoothing the collars of shirts that belonged to men who gave orders and praised her to their friends, nudging a sleeping child from slumber with the soft crook of an elbow. Whether she was a biological mother mattered less than the truth of her hands. Children who lived under the wide eaves of the Mendoza hacienda learned to seek Rosa for lollipops with a rationed sugar cube, for a bandage tucked into a palm, for a story that smelled of stew and dawn. When they called Mama in the dark, they meant the woman whose presence made the place live. Don Rafael Mendoza had bound her, not in a story anyone would call romantic, but in a small human transaction of need. In the years after the revolution, when men came and went and houses were more dangerous than sanctuaries, he had kept her on. He said she knew the house before its owners did, as if the wood itself had taught her its grain. He paid her little by the measure of the town. He paid her more with an old, careful respect that carried itself like a code. Do the job, keep your dignity, be counted. In a town that sometimes discarded people like outworn cloth, Don Rafael's house was a place that counted its keepers. The mantel above the hearth held a small photograph in a silvered frame. Don Rafael in his better years, a broad-shouldered man in a suit that had seen finer days. Rosa had once tucked the frame into her apron to polish the glass, and found tucked behind it a folded piece of paper with a child's allowance of coins and a note in a hand that was never hers. Don Rafael, with a conspirator smile, had winked and said it was for necessities. She never asked for more. She did not need to. These were the small satisfactions that braided her life. The courtyard had its own calendar. The morning fog lifted at the same hour as the rooster's first claim, the workday measured by the arc of the sun across the kitchen tiles. Rosa knew the exact weight of a sack of beans by lifting it once. She knew the time it took for stew to thicken so she could pour it into bowls and watch for the shine that marked readiness. Dignity for her was tactile.
It lived in a cloth freshly ironed, a child's skirt hem mended, a pot returned to its place. The sealed envelope had been mentioned in the hush of the funeral, like an echo of a household secret, words spoken too softly for people who habitually raised their voices. Don Rafael, some said, had been the kind of man who kept things for the long view. When he died, the house gathered like a body. Visitors came and left, and the will read aloud did not contain everything. It spoke of bequests, of small matters settled with deliberate clarity, and at the end, the notary's voice paused and said that one item would remain sealed, to be opened under witness at a later, safer time. That pause lodged itself in Rosa's chest like a pebble thrown into still water. The envelope was not for now. It was, instead, a seam in time that would be cut later. Valentina Mendoza kept seams in another way. She had the posture of a person accustomed to being in view. Where Rosa's murmur was steady and soft, Valentina's laugh came out like a command. The niece's clothes were always pressed, her hair fell in a practiced wave, and she never left a bowl or ledger open. The house had once been hers to inherit by a straightforward map of blood and names, yet families are not only geography. They are also stories told to each other at table. Valentina had been taught that things belonged to those who declared them loudly enough. She watched Rosa in the early mornings with a crease of opinion between her brows. There was, Valentina thought, the wrong kind of intimacy in Rosa's ease with the house. To have someone who knew where every brass knob lived, to have someone who could call upstairs and summon the household without being summoned themselves, that was power. Quiet power, perhaps, but power nonetheless. Valentina guarded the house like a fortress full of invisible measures. She was careful, and she had the town's attentions on her side, men who admired a woman who could be both polished and ruthless, and a staff who obeyed with lingering fear. Lupita was younger, and saw the world as mostly opportunity and quick decisions. She found a coin one afternoon near the pantry, bright and new as a sunbeam, and slipped it into her apron with the taste of small rebellion on her tongue. She did not see the meaning of a single coin. She saw the immediate thrill. A coin is only metal until someone names it gilt. That naming happened later, when conscience woke and found her in the dark of the yard, the coin hot in her palm like a coal. Esteban, often called Esteban by those who felt they could instruct him, walked with a foreman's gait, shoulders forward, steps measured in her portable length. He had given testimony once before, words that were quick and meant to stop trouble from lasting too long. He had believed that loyalty was to stability, to keeping a house running without the noise of disruption. When pushed, he had pushed. When asked, he had answered.
But the muscles that guided machinery did not always guide shame, and the sound of someone lowering their head and saying, "I was wrong," has the weight of a bell. On the day Don Rafael's body left the house and the funeral returned to the hush of its ordinary days, Valentina moved in with a precision that suggested ownership. She sorted the ledger under her elbow, checked the count of cattle with a hand that felt at home on the spine of papers and wallets. There were eyes in the town that liked Valentina's confidence. There were also eyes that watched Rosa with a tenderness that made them look away when Valentina's voice rose. The coins were planted in a place everyone knew Rosa would touch. Valentina had no need to shout. She did not need to. She placed a small set of coins in the flour bin where Rosa measured bread's faithfulness, as if a lone wind had mightily spilled treasure into daily bread. Lupita, who had been sent for a bowl of masa, found them and told no one. She took them to a small room under the stairs and hid them like contraband. That hiding was its own sin. Secrecy transforms a thing into evidence. When the coins were found, not by Valentina herself, but by someone else in the household who had an eye for discrepancy, the air in the kitchen shifted. Valentina knew how to breathe that air differently. She called the commissario in a measured voice. She stood in the doorway while people gathered, their lanterns trembling like hesitant witnesses. Accusation can be made from a distance. It need not be a shout. A gesture, a look, a ledger flipped to a suspicious page. These are the tools of power when a whisper can be made into law. Rosa was taken from the kitchen in the dark of an evening that smelled of wood smoke and the cloth of laundry. The crowd that gathered outside the house spoke in the measured rhythm of a town that liked to be seen taking action. No one touched her. The abuse she suffered was an institutional thing, a legalistic removal dressed as necessity. The commissario read the accusation like a clerk reading tax records. He could have said that this was a misunderstanding. Instead, he said what enforcement demanded. The accused must step away until inquiry. She stood at the threshold with that small clay mug clenched like a talisman. The mug, warm from the last of the stew, sent up a sigh of steam that caught the lanterns and made the small courtyard look like a mouth of soft light. Rosa kept her voice low when she spoke, and when she did not speak, her silence was not empty, but an accumulation of patient things. In the hush that followed the accusation, she did something that will cling to the memory of many who saw it. She wiped the rim of her mug and set it down on the low stone step, as if returning the day to its place. That act, ordinary, unglamorous, read to some like a refusal to be dehumanized. It could have been worse. There was no beating, no public spectacle of blows. The community's violence was quieter, reputations rearranged, livelihoods suspended. Exile in that town did not mean banishment to some distant land. It meant being placed outside the social arithmetic that formed lives. Rosa was not allowed to sleep in the servants' wing or to set foot in the rooms she had kept with such fastidious care. She walked instead to the church that had always been a shelter of small sanctuaries, confessions whispered in corners, the priest's office with its thick curtains, the sacristy with needles and thread waiting. Padre Miguel received her at the back door. He had hands like someone who had spent his life lifting people out of the minor dams of daily sorrow. His face was a map of mercy, a red-nosed man who had cried at a child's funeral and then spent weeks helping rebuild the frame of the house left behind. He did not ask for proof when she arrived. He handed her a blanket and a cup and told her that a roof does more than keep out rain. It keeps out the idea that you are alone. The shelter the church offered was modest, blankets on pews, a small kitchen where beans could be warmed, and a side room where a woman could sit in the half-light and sew. Rosa accepted the shelter like she accepted water. She did not ask for pity. In the morning she rose and made coffee in a chipped mug that had been left in a cabinet and carried it down the aisle. Children who came to catechism folded their hands and looked to her as if she were bone and marrow of a safe place. Word travels in towns like the one around the Mendoza hacienda. It travels on the wind and in the corridor of gossip, on the benches by the mercado and the swings suspended from the ceiba tree. The story of Rosa's removal from lodging in more than one mouth. Some repeated the accusation like scripture. Others said the accusation would not stand. Lupita, who had the coins in her secret pocket like a hot ember, woke at night and felt the pressure of small metal against her ribs. She began to spend her days avoiding the house and her nights trying to imagine the shape of an apology without knowing how to shape the word. Esteban came to Padre Miguel's door with the greasy smell of the fields still clinging to his work shirt. He spoke in an ironed-out voice, the kind that asked for something with the weight of a textbook.
He had given testimony the night of Rosa's exile, a nod that broke a woman's life into a public problem and a private ruin. Now he wanted to unmake his words. The sound of men confessing to error has a heavy particularity. It is not melodramatic, it is slow and awkward and necessary. The notary, Lentato Fuentes, was a man whose work required careful, slow hands and a respect for the law's small rituals. He had been at Don Raphael's reading, his ledger crisp on the table. He had taken the sealed envelope from the funeral with a notary's reference and deposited it in a small safe behind a shelf of dust-mottled books.
The will, he thought, had been explicit. Seals are respected, caregivers are named, bequests measured. The law is a cord meant to bind harm. In his office, the safe sat like a lung waiting to exhale. Fuentes lived by the cadence of documents. A page signed meant a life shifted. He knew that opening the envelope would not simply reveal paper, it would tilt the geometry of the household. He also knew that wills could be instruments for both justice and the appearance of justice. The town expected him to be precise, to read, to verify, to produce order. He kept his ledger and inkpot near his right hand and a small wafer of bread in his desk drawer, more for its ritual memory than for hunger. Even the notary was not untouched by gossip. He was prudent, and prudence was the skin of his trade. He did not rush to open the envelope because the law had its rhythms and because the estate had its public performance. A sealed testament is a promise that a voice will be heard at the proper hour. The hour, for now, had not come. The envelope remained a promise. But the town is a force that pushes against waiting. People will apply pressure. They will call for decisions. And when someone does, the machinery of law must respond. The first nights after the accusation, Rosa slept under a blanket that smelled faintly of incense. She did not allow herself to be crushed by fury, because fury does not mend linens or keep children clothed. Instead, she practiced the small economies of care. She taught a boy how to tie knots that would not unravel, showed a girl how to press a shirt without burning the fabric. In her hands, the world was made of ordinary miracles, the tightness of a proper seam, the correct angle to lift a pot so that stew would not spill. She lived her truth in gestures. But there were moments when grief, like dampness, soaked through the outward fabric of daily practice. When the moon was a half-smile and the town's dogs made their rounds, she would stand at the church window and look at the house from across the square. She could see a light move through the scarred panes and imagine all the rooms she had put in order. The photograph that sat in the church's kitchen, a borrowed frame where the image of Don Raphael seemed to watch over both the kitchen and its displaced keeper, was a small anchor. Rosa would take the photograph out sometimes and press her forehead to the glass as if to hear the muffled sound of things that were once contained being set in place again. There were rumors, of course. Valentina had a way of setting stories loose that made them look like truth. She implied mismanagement, suggested that those who worked in the house were careless with expectations. The gossip that followed her was careful and precise. It was, many noticed, what certain people called power, the ability to shape other people's lives with nothing more than tone and insinuation. But rumor is a fragile thing until joined by supposed evidence. When the coins were finally found in a place known to be Rosa's in the mind of the household, not because she had put them there, but because routine suggested she would touch that place, the alignment of accusation was swift. Valentina held up the coins with the stage-like grace of someone presenting proof. The commissario read the list of possible charges, his voice like a mallet on a bell. The legal architecture of the town, which is supposed to protect people, can be turned toward punishment with a few choices and a few words. Rosa did not answer the charges with theatrics. She did not shout her innocence. What would shouting change? Her silence was not of guilt, but of calculation. She knew that survival in that town often required choosing the weather one could live in. She packed a small bag, a linen shirt, the clay mug, the photograph, and walked to the church with a patience that was at once stubborn and gentle. The people at the well watched her go, some with eyes that had always loved her, others with eyes that had lent themselves to the rumor. The town's justice closed over her like a night that was not her choosing. Padre Miguel, when he learned of the accusation, did not ask for paper or proof. He only asked for food to be set, and for Rosa to tell him where the hurt lived in her chest. The priest listened as one listens to the weather. He offered what he could: shelter, counsel, a small stipend drawn from the church's modest fund. He also offered something less tangible, the belief that a human being could be harmed by society and still hold on to a basic grace. That is perhaps the most dangerous charity, an insistence that dignity continues even when the world has used it poorly. Meanwhile, Fuentes the notary held the sealed envelope like a contraption of possibility. He was a man who enjoyed the ritual of his profession. The safe required a small key that had been cut in a shop on the other side of town. He had the key wrapped with a strip of paper that said, "Do not open until," and then the rest blurred into formal language. The opening of a sealed will is a public event, the bringing out of a private instruction. The town would listen, the town would stand. The town would make either a confession or a verdict, depending on what paper said. Lupita, carrying the marrow of guilt like something heavy in her pockets, came to the church late one afternoon. She found Rosa by the garden wall, her hands in the dirt, tending to a small bed of marigolds that brightened the shadow of the nave. The little act of caretaking was Rosa's way of fixing a world that was not always fixable with words. "I hid them," Lupita said, and the confession was a thin thing, sounding like someone calling in a debt they could not pay. Rosa did not raise her head much. "Who put them where you found them?" she asked gently. "It was Valentina's doing," Lupita said. She swallowed a small fear. "She said it would make things easier."
She promised me work, more hours. I thought... Valentina widened her smile and spoke to neighbors in a fashion that made events appear inevitable. The commissario circulated an air of firm responsibility that made many feel safer. If someone was accused, at least there was action, and action is a kind of comfort. But small facts have stubborn ways of asserting themselves. The notary safe did not lie, nor did the ledger. Some mornings, a document arrives from a distant town with the quietness of inevitability. Signatures, official stamps, midwife notes, and names that swell the weight of truth. When the facts accumulate, they form a current that is difficult to redirect with simply a voice full of commands. The law may be abused, but it also possesses the tools it takes to restore. On the day the notary finally decided to disturb the seal, he did it alone, with the kind of solemnity that comes from living a life among archives. The envelope was a small thing that held the potential for a life to be rearranged. He set it on his desk, a surface that had seen marriages settled and plantations' boundaries drawn, and reached for the small brass blade that would slit its seam. The room smelled of old paper and ink and a slight citrus of the oil he used to polish his shoes. He held the blade and thought about the consequences of any sound a paper might make when it was opened. At the church, Rosa taught a child the right way to fold a napkin. Her hands moved as if memory and trade had braided into one unbroken skill. She had a kind of authority that did not require shouts, the quiet surety that comes from a person who knows what she can give. It was that certainty, more than any legal hope, that made her rise each morning. And then the town began to wait. If this story is speaking to you and you want to follow how dignity can travel from the small palm of a clay mug to the heavy ledger of a notary, subscribe and stay with us. There are more lives to meet in this one house. As the notary's knife shivered at the edge of the paper, the town held its breath in small ways. Lupita lay awake and reviewed the steps she had taken. Esteban came to the church and sat with his head in his hands. Padre Miguel set a candle about to be lit on the altar and said a quiet prayer that was half petition and half insistence that truth not be mangled by the will of rumor. Valentina, who had spent months calibrating a public face, practiced polite dignity in front of her mirror, unaware that small things she thought had been decisive might soon be read in other lights. Rosa, sitting at the edge of the chapel yard with her mug warming in the sun, felt the shape of a future she could not yet name. She had lived in a life of chores that meant nothing to those who counted worth by ledgers, and she had tried to fit herself into the place habit and love had built. Motherhood, whether to a child with a name or to the children of the hacienda, had given her a framework to act from.
The title mother in the town's mouth was ambiguous, a word that held both tenderness and the weight of expectation. She accepted the name, not because it made her larger, but because it matched the care she gave. The notary's brass blade sliced the envelope seam with a small, decisive whisper. There are sounds that arrive like a first note in a piece of music. The opening of that envelope was one. Fuentes unfolded the paper and read. His voice did not carry through the town square yet. He read to himself first, eyes scanning for legal clarity. He saw the name Rosa Hernandez spelled in a hand he recognized, Don Rafael's hand, patient and deliberate. There were lines that spoke of records, a midwife's note perhaps, or a baptismal record, mention of a person the house took in, of care rendered and counted for. He felt the air in his office compress itself against the truth of a man who had apparently written of a debt owed to a servant that was more than coins. He did not in that moment call the town to its feet. It was not his way to perform revelation. But as he turned the paper over and matched its script to known curiosities of Don Rafael's notations, a slow sense of obligation moved through him. He would do what a notary must do: summon witnesses, set a time, record. Formality would be the vessel into which the town would pour its satisfactions and its remorse. Outside, Rosa fixed a child's sleeve and tied a knot that held firm. The photograph waited by the clay mug, the two small objects like a shrine to the life she intended to maintain. She did not know the content of Don Rafael's last hand, nor did she need to know the exact phrase. For a woman raised in the rhythm of work, papers were as mysterious as the weather. But a sealed testament was a hinge. When the hinge moved, lives might be rearranged. The notary closed the office at dusk,
taking with him the weight of the paper but not yet its performance. He had the envelope and its unwrapping in his drawer like a seed in soil. He knew the town would press him for a reading, and he knew that when he set a date, the house would be crowded and the ledger of the town would have to reconcile itself with the facts. His duty in law and in conscience was to make that reconciliation as careful as possible. Night came over the hacienda with the soft sigh of doors being latched. Rosa slept in the church under a blanket that smelled faintly of lemon soap. She dreamed of hands, her own hands washing linen until it was white as a promise, and woke with the ache of possibility like a small bird fluttering in her chest. The town sleep was restless. Rumors move even in slumber. At dawn, when Rosa again put the clay mug to her lips, she did not know what the day would hold. She only knew what she must do. Mend what is torn, feed the hungry, hold a child's fevered forehead with the practical ministrations of someone who had known illness and soothed it over the years.
To keep the house, to keep a household, is to move through 1,000 small decisions that go unnoticed by a world that tallies worth in larger currencies. But when those larger currencies are called into play, legal documents, sealed wills, the public reading of names, the small decisions sometimes prove to be the backbone of survival. The envelope in the notary's drawer would have to be read aloud at some appointed hour, and when that hour came, the town would convene in the notary's office, which in that region doubles as a place where public life becomes visible in paperwork and signatures. People would stand and listen. Children would press their faces against windows. The air would feel like a net, taut, waiting to catch something that might otherwise drift away. Rosa did not know yet whether the paper would name her as a person of consequence or simple bequest. She only held the small things she had brought with her: the clay mug, the photograph, a linen apron stitched on the corner with caring fingers. The mother in her desired a quiet return to the work of tending, of administering small mercies. She believed, perhaps in the way the poor always do, that a person's dignity can be recovered by the reiterated acts of daily care. When the notary finally set a day, he did so because his hand had matched script to memory, and because law requires that a voice be heard for the sake of record. He sent word quietly at first, so as not to inflame. The townspeople heard in a dozen different ways: through a whisper at the mercado, through a note left on a bench, through a watchful friend who could not keep silence. The date would be announced with the dryness of officialdom, and people, who have been known to imagine justice as the swift and obvious thing, began to count who would be present. Valentina, who had arranged the argument against Rosa with a care that had become habit, made plans. She would attend with a face of glass. She would refuse to be undone by ink. She would rely on her confidence, on her many small alliances with men who had careers and accounts to settle. The public scene would be a theater, she thought, and she would be its star. But in the notary's office, the paper that had been folded with care sat open, inscrutable and patient. Fuentes read it twice to be certain, checking the names and the notations, feeling the careful intention of a man who had kept an old house and who had kept secrets, and who perhaps had been trying, in the waning of his breath, to set right small wrongs he saw. The page contains, as notary's papers sometimes do, both formal instruction and scraps of human tenderness disguised as legal phrases. To read is to be entrusted. Fuentes had to measure that trust like a man who weighs gold. So much of life, when viewed as a stack of papers and claims, can be reduced to the dull thud of official noises. But for Rosa, the presence of a sealed document had always been a mystery, and that mystery moved through the town like a rumor that has learned to stay polite. People would come when called, and when the notary read aloud the name in a hand that had once held the house with a peculiar kindness, something would shift. The power that had isolated her might be called back into a public reckoning. The morning of the reading arrived with a sun that cut the kitchen tiles like a blade. Children were taught to wait. Adults suggested their faces. The notary's office filled with a list of people that represented the town as if in microcosm: the priest who loved to patch things, the foreman who wanted to confess, the young woman who had pocketed coins and who now carried the taste of contrition, the niece with her poised face, and a corps of neighbors who had always loved Rosa. The town's attention felt like the light through a window. It revealed details and left others in shadow. Rosa arrived with the same restraint she had always carried. She did not need to perform sorrow or triumph. She sat in a corner where witnesses could see her, and she pressed her hands together in a habit that made them look like folded cloth. The photograph and clay mug were in a small bag at her feet like sacrament, an emblem of a life made of small things. Fuentes cleared his throat and began to read, in a voice that was a machine for precision.
He read the name slowly, pronouncing each syllable with the respect a law requires, and the room leaned in as if it had ears that had been waiting for the first use of sound. The notary's words are a place where an ordinary life can be made visible. They contain the capacity to shift what has been merely rumor into what is reachably true. When Don Raphael's hand was interpreted for a town to hear, it said things that made people catch their breath. Names were called not as echoes but as claims. Records were invoked, paper that meant birth, witness, midwife notes, arranged like a stubborn architecture of fact. For Rosa, the sound of her name in that room was like a bell rung underwater. It came slow and clear, and then multiplied into the air. Valentina's gaze changed. She shifted in her seat like someone whose props are being removed. The coin she had presented as evidence took on a different cast under the sober light of signatures and records. People who had been certain reassessed their certainties, like people revising a map. Esteban's throat made a sound that was a small breaking. Lupita's hands were like leaves in the wind. Padre Miguel gave his head a small bow that had the weight of someone acknowledging that the rightness of an act will not always match the comfort of friendship. The notary's reading was a machine that converted private intention into public fact. When it was done, the ledger would be marked, and something that had been hidden would stand in the record for all to see.
And yet, the room did not explode into applause. The notary did not fashion a victory speech. That is not what legal readings are for. They are, rather, the sober recognition that rights have been remembered. A sealed will is less a trumpet than a ledger. It records. It makes things counted, and thereby returns them, in law, to a place they had been removed from. Rosa felt the force of her name like heat. It warmed it and it unnerved her in equal measure. She did not jump up to claim anything. She held the new truth like a hot something just taken from the oven, careful in the way of someone who has known how quickly things can cool. The town had not yet decided how to be generous with repair. The law had placed a mark. The more difficult work, that of living together, of public apology, of reform, still lay ahead. But a document had been read. It had removed the fog of accusation from a life that had been standing in shadow. Outside, people muttered, reassessed, made sudden shifts in alliances, offered small apologies like bandages. Valentina's gaze moved like an animal tracking how to defend herself with the illusions that had served her. She would not be undone quickly. The machinery of law had set the frame. The machinery of justice, of human repair, would have to follow. Rosa left the notary's office with her mug in its bag and the photograph pressed against her chest. She did not march. She walked home the way she always walked, with purpose and with care. The house that had once barred her doors was not yet a place of open arms. There was much to be arranged. The reading had removed a pin from a tight seam. The seam would have to be resewn. That is the nature of restitution. It rewrites public record, but does not rearrange years of small injuries without attention. At the edge of the courtyard, Valentina found herself alone with a ledger and the sharp awareness that inheritance is never only about blood. It is also about how people decide to use the power they have. The coin that had been planted in flour, the whisper that had led to exile, these were instruments of a will that was now challenged. She clenched her hands and tried to make her face hold its default grace. Rosa approached the kitchen and set the photograph by the fogan. When Rosa crossed the light, Valentina rose. She did not move like a woman poised to strike. She moved like someone who had been given a script and found the words inadequate. "You have your things," Valentina said, voice even. She set the ledger flat, as if to offer it a middle place between them. "You have your name. The town knows what the paper said." Rosa did not answer right away. She set the clay mug on the stone beside the fogan and felt the heat press back into her palm. It was the small things that steadied her. Ceramic warm from the fire, photographs smooth with a life of fingerprints. She folded her hands the way she had learned to fold shirts for a trunk, and then looked at Valentina. "Paper can name a right," Rosa said, softly, "but it does not mend what was said in front of many mouths. It does not feed the children who slept cold, or fix beds that sagged like old boats." Valentina's eyes narrowed, not in accusation so much as calculation. "What would you have me do, Rosa? I have a claim here. Blood gives me the right. People respected my stewardship when your place was all ready. When the house needed someone," Rosa finished, and she did it without anger. "When the house needed tending, someone kept it. That is not a diminishment of anyone's right to their name, but the work of the house is more than land. It is people." There was a silence, a small pause in which their hens scratched under the eaves, and a child went by with a cup to fetch water. Then Padre Miguel stepped from the shade, followed by Lentiato Fuentes with his official seal tucked into a pocket, and Dr. Ramirez with a small cloth smelling faintly of iodine. Behind them came Esteban, plain-faced and still smelling of the field, and Lupita, who came last and held herself like a woman who had been carrying something too long. Fuentes closed the ledger gently and set his hand upon it. "The law has done part of its work," he said. "It has declared names and given record. The rest must be decided by those who live under the same roof." Valentina made a small sound that could have been a laugh, but was more like an exhalation of someone who had to make room for a new shape. "And what do you expect?" she asked. "Am I to kneel before the staff, to be made to apologize?" Rosa met her gaze, not with triumph, but with a firmness that felt like worked wood. Not kneel, to speak what happened and take steps so it does not happen again, to make the house safe for those who sleep under its eaves, to fix the ledger so we all can read it, to make sure a child's fever is seen by a doctor they can reach, to put names on the list of those who will be fed when times are lean. Valentina's features shifted. She had been taught to think of power as a right to command rather than as a duty to mend. The notion that power entailed repair was foreign and yet practical in a way that pinched at a new conscience.
She looked down at the ledger Fuentes had set before her, at the neat columns that had become, during this week, less a tool of secrecy and more a challenge. Esteban stepped forward then, in a voice that had the roughness of soil. "I was part of pushing that story," he said. "I thought I was stopping something worse. I spoke so the trouble would be ended. I did not listen. I am sorry. If there is work to be done, I will do it. I will help fix the beds. I will teach the others to mind the ledger." His apology landed like a small stone. It was not gilded. It was heavy and real. Lupita came beside him, cheeks pale. "I hid the coin," she said, and the confession came out in a rush. "I wanted more hours. I wanted to buy books for my sister. I was ashamed, and I thought if I did what was expected, they reward me. I am sorry, Rosa. I have nothing to give except my work. I will return the rest of what I took, and I will work it off. I will help in the kitchen. I will show the children how to read." She looked at Rosa as if asking permission to be forgiven. Rosa listened. She could have ridden the moment like a crest, made Valentina's fall into a spectacle of triumph. She did none of that. She folded her hands, and the simple movement settled the faces around her. "I do not want to make a theater of this," Rosa said. "Punishment is not our trade. There are children who need a roof and a doctor. There are women who must sleep without the fear of losing their place in the morning. The house is breaking in places where we can fix it. I will accept what the law gives me, but I ask for certain things in return." Her words were plain and careful, as one who measured thread. She named them simply: a public apology read and recorded, co-management of household affairs, so decisions about food and pay and sleeping arrangements would include the people who sustain the house, a transparent ledger posted weekly, where workers could see accounts and claims, the establishment of a small clinic fund with Dr. Ramirez overseeing a basic provision of medicines, a tiny schoolroom for the workers' children, where someone could teach reading and numbers, and a modest allotment of improved rations, so meals would be reliable, not mercurial. Valentina's mouth compressed. "You want to run the house?" she asked. The accusation came out like a mirror. "I want to care for the house as it has always been cared for," Rosa said. "If my name is in the record, then my hands should also be written into the way this place is run. I will not take what belongs to you. I ask for a voice." Fuentes produced a fresh sheet and a pen. "We can write this down," he said, "and enter it in the municipal record. An apology can be read and signed. Co-management can be defined in terms of duties and oversight. The commissario can supervise the posting of the ledger." He looked then to the commissario who had once read the accusation. The man nodded as if seeing a redemption he could administer. Valentina's laugh this time was small and brittle. "And if I refuse?" she asked. "Then the law stands," Fuentes replied, straightforward. "But the town will know. People can decide what kind of stewardship they prefer. If you refuse to participate in repair, the others will work to keep the house together without you. That will be the legacy you leave." There was a pause, the kind that holds a decision like a fruit on a branch. Valentina thought of the face she could present at church, of neighbors who admired the assurance she had practiced like an instrument. She thought of her voice read back to her as a litany of refusal. She had wanted the house to be hers by name. Now that a different name had been placed beside hers, her instincts came to a reckoning. "I will speak," she said finally, with a voice that showed a newly unsteady willingness. "I will apologize in public. I will sign whatever is required. I will open the ledger for people to see. I will contribute funds to the small clinic. I will allow a teacher in the mornings." Her words were not a confession of malice. They were the quiet calculation of someone who saw that the cost of refusal would be a harder loneliness than she had anticipated. There was shame in her admission, and it showed as a slight tremor in the habitual smoothness of her face. Fuentes set down his pen and wrote the terms as they were spoken, giving legal shape to acts that were meant to repair more than register. He read them back: apology, co-management, ledger transparency, clinic fund, school, improved rations, and a community oversight committee. The names of those who would serve on the committee were simple: Rosa Hernandez as co-manager, Valentina Mendoza as co-heir participating in administration, Padre Miguel as spiritual and moral witness, Dr. Ramirez as medical officer, Esteban to oversee repair and labor distribution, and a rotating group of workers to ensure voice. The terms were modest, not punitive, a contract for living together. Valentina signed first. Her hand shook, but she set her name down. Then Esteban, then Lupita, then Padre. But the apology, placed on paper and in Fuentes' record, was now a public thing. It carried weight because the notary had witnessed it, and because the community, Padre Miguel, Dr. Ramirez, Esteban, Lupita, and a ring of workers had been present. Rosa listened as Valentina read, and then rose to speak herself. She did not demand an apology's flourish. She spoke about practical things: the children's needs, the clinic supplies, the ledger's posting. She asked for specifics in the agreement: a monthly allotment for medicine donated by Valentina in the first year, a teacher's salary to be partly funded by household profits, and a weekly public meeting to review the ledger where any worker could ask a question and receive an answer. "Do you know how much it means," she said, addressing Valentina directly, "for a mother to know a child will see a doctor when fever comes, for a woman's pay to be counted and written where she can read it? These are small things. They are not grand gestures. They are daily dignity." Valentina swallowed and nodded. The sight of her acknowledging such small, necessary things was the closest thing the morning had to redemption. There would be later tests of courage: how to share a kitchen, how to divide decisions, how to rewrite old patterns, but the foundation had been laid. In the weeks that followed, the hacienda smelled of sawdust and soap. Esteban organized teams to repair beds and fix the sagging bunks in the servants' wing. Men and women worked side by side under his direction. He was not the same man he had been. There was an earned humility on his shoulders that made his commands steadier because he had learned to listen. Lupita labored openly, returning small coins she could, and she began to teach one afternoon a week, sitting on the low step with children on her lap while she practiced letters on scraps of paper. She taught them to trace names, to understand that a name could be held like a small lamp. Dr. Ramirez cleared a small room off the courtyard, swept it clean, and began stocking a shelf with bandages, oil, and basic medicines. The clinic fund Valentina had committed to helped buy a cot and a few tins of antiseptic. He put a hand on Rosa's shoulder when the first child with a high temperature arrived, and when he gave the mother a small medicine bottle and a list of how to keep a fever measured. "This will save a life one day," he said, with the matter-of-factness of a man who had sat beside many beds. Rosa took on the ledger like a woman learning a new craft. Fuentes and Rosa went over columns together: income, expenses, rations, gifts, small bequests. She learned how to balance a sheet and how to read the small legal language that had turned her name into a rightful thing. She insisted the ledger be placed on a shelf in the kitchen where anyone could peer at it. Each week a meeting was held under the jacaranda, the pages turned aloud, and questions were answered plainly. For the first time in a long time, the staff could see how the house's wealth moved. Valentina's role shifted from a solitary overseer to a partner with at least one rival voice that would not be silenced. She grew awkward in that role at first. She sat with Rosa over a pile of receipts, and at times their discussion was tense. Names debated, rations argued. But slowly, in the small economies of giving and listening, their working languages began to translate into each other. Valentina found herself in private moments asking Rosa how certain things had been done in the past and listening to the answers, not as a skeptic, but as a student. Restorative justice did not mean Rome burnt and everyone cheered. It meant that people did small, steady work to repair what had been loosened. It meant that Valentina had to face those she had humiliated and sit with them at a table where decisions were made. It meant that Rosa had to expand her mothering into the realm of administration, a new kind of labor that required paper and signature as much as soup and stitches. There were setbacks. A ledger entry once miscounted and tempers rose. A farmer believed a distribution had been unfair and the commissario was called to mediate.
Valentina had a day when she reverted to the old way of keeping secrets, and a neighbor reminded her publicly of the signed apology. But each setback was of a different quality now. They were moments of repair rather than proof of irredeemable character. The town had new language for mistakes: apology, repair, public accounting. In the months that followed, a small classroom opened in an annex near the chapel. Padre Miguel found a woman who could teach the children to read and to count, and word spread that children who attended the little school were learning to sign their names in a way that made their parents' faces shine. The clinic gained its rhythm. Dr. Ramirez set office hours, and a volunteer from the town came with a small case of tinctures. Esteban and the repair crew taught the younger men to mend beds properly, to fix broken tiles, to treat the water cistern so it would not carry sickness. Rosa walked through these changes with the same hands that had once smoothed sheets before dawn. She still woke with the first light and warmed her clay mug, and the ritual of steam and hands remained constant. But now her mornings might include a meeting where she argued about how to allocate funds for school books and conversed with Valentina about the weight of taxes on cattle sales. She kept the photograph by the fogan, and in that space between the cooking and the accounts, she mothered both. There was a moment 6 months after the reading when the hacienda felt outwardly different. The beds in the servants' wing held pillows that did not sag. The children's cheeks were pinker from steady meals. A line of small shoes rested beneath the classroom door. People moved with less of the hush of fear.
They still measured their words at times. Old habits die slowly, but there was a sturdiness to the air, like a cloth newly hemmed. On a market day, the notary's ledger was posted at the hacienda gate, as it always had been for the weekly meeting. A woman from the market came and read aloud the week's expenses: a new tin of medicine bought with Valentina's donation, wages for the teacher, a small sum set aside for maintaining the cistern. She looked up, surprised to find a group of workers listening intently. A child in a red dress tugged at her sleeve and asked what a salary was, and Lupita knelt to explain it in the patient curving of words she had learned under the jacaranda. Valentina, who now often sat beside Rosa at the ledger table, watched a boy walk by with a math book tucked under his arm. There was a softness in her eyes that had not been there a year ago, not because she had been redeemed completely, no single act does that, but because she had learned the cost of a community's wound and chosen to be part of its mending. She came to Rosa later that afternoon and, in a voice without pomp, said, "Thank you for asking for what mattered." Rosa shook her head gently. "You did what had always to be done," she said, meaning that repair required the participation of many hands. "Thank you for staying with the work." Esteban, who had once been too quick to name and too slow to ask, began to take the younger men out to mend fencing and to teach them the particularness of care. He would demonstrate how to tie a knot that would hold, and then pause and say, almost shyly, "I was wrong. That is how we go forward." The public apology he gave had been small but palpable. He had not expected gratitude, only the chance to be useful. Not every wound closed. There were relatives in town who continued to whisper that Valentina had been forced into apology by the will, and thus that she had not truly repented. There were neighbors who believed Rosa's return could not undo years of quiet dispossession. But for the people who lived and slept under the same eaves, the daily facts of care made a more persuasive argument than rumor. The clinic saved a child's life when a fever spiked unexpectedly. A teacher's lesson created a sentence that a child read aloud with pride. The ledger's openness prevented a miscount and avoided a fight that would have otherwise broken out at harvest. Rosa's authority became something neither domineering nor theatrical. It was a steady, maternal governance. She moved through the house like a woman with calendar in one hand and a bandage in the other. She sometimes found herself taking Valentina's hand in a rough reassurance when the niece's confidence faltered. On other days, she leaned across the ledger and argued a point with a clarity that showed how indignity sharpened rather than dulled her voice. The clay mug and the photograph remained constant motifs in her life.
When she felt the weight of her new duties, meetings, arguments, reconciliations, she would sit by the fogan at dawn with the mug in her hands and breathe in the steam as if to let breakfast set her spine straight. The photograph kept Don Raphael's face in the room, not as a ghost of control, but as a reminder that small acts of kindness, recorded and named, can have long echoes. One evening, Padre Miguel called together a modest gathering to mark the half-year since the reading. They stood in the courtyard beneath strings of simple lights,
and the small classroom's children performed a song about seeds and growth. Valentina read a brief note about the clinic's progress. Esteban announced the completion of a row of repaired beds. Lupita handed out a basket of fresh bread she had helped bake. Dr. Ramirez spoke plainly about the difference that a basic supply of medicines had made. The commissario nodded, because the house quieted and the town did not need his hand as often. When the children sang the closing lines, Rosa felt something settle inside her that was not triumph, but the patient satisfaction of a thing sewn properly. She thought of the nights in the church when she had held the photograph and the mug, and wondered which would come first, the return of name or the return of work. Both had come, but in a manner she had not expected. The law had named her. The work of the community had made the name live. Later, beside the fogon, Rosa and Valentina sat with cups warming their hands. They did not rehearse apologies or catalog debts. They spoke of small, practical things: the teacher's next lesson plan, the arrival of a shipment of nails, the scheduling of cistern cleaning. The work had flattened differences into tasks that required cooperation. "Do you ever regret it?" Valentina asked quietly, the question of someone who had learned that power is not a prize but a responsibility. Rosa took a slow sip and set the mug down, the steam curling like a promise. "Regret what?" she asked. "Being so quick to hold others in suspicion," Valentina said. Her voice was surrendered. "I thought I was protecting what was mine. I could not see when mine included others." Rosa smiled, a small, weary thing. "We are always learning the scale of what is ours," she said. "Sometimes we think it is land or name. Often it is the people who keep the hearth burning." Time did not smooth every rough edge, but it did change the patterns of life at the hacienda. The children learned to write their names on a long strip of paper ferreted out by the teacher. The clinic had a small shelf of remedies and a chair for waiting mothers. The ledger, once a private instrument, hung in the kitchen where anyone could ask to see it. People came and went, but the work continued in a way that made the house less fragile.
Rosa remained a mother in the truest sense the house had known, a woman whose care extended beyond bloodlines, whose authority had the dimension of tenderness tied to responsibility. She did not wear a sash or make proclamations. Her power was the slow accumulation of acts that protected, provided, and repaired. She organized the ration schedule so the old and the sick would be fed on time. She arranged for the teacher's salary to be paid first each month. She made sure that when a worker's hand was burned, Dr. Ramirez would be there with a clean bandage. On a soft dawn months later, Rosa again warmed the clay mug and watched the sun lift its face above the fields. She felt the sight of the photograph in the kitchen like a small, steady presence. The house had not returned to the one it had been before accusations and exile and sealed documents. It had become something else, less hierarchical in the old way, more tangled in the necessary way of shared life. There were mornings when her shoulders ached from ledger pages, and mornings when her hands were raw from mending a torn shirt. The labor had not lessened. It had multiplied into other kinds of duty. But the measure of that labor had changed. Where once her work had been invisible, now it had an accounting in ink and a place in conversation. People in the town began to tell the story as one with a lesson that could be told plainly, that a name written in the proper hand can restore legal claim, and that what follows must be careful tending. Some said Rosa had been lucky. Others said the law had finally done justice. Those who lived in the house told another kind of detail, how the teacher bent to teach small hands, how the clinic saved a child's life in the height of summer, how Esteban now paused to ask before he acted. The photograph by the fogon kept a record in its quiet way. Don Rafael's face, silvered and patient, looked out in a kitchen that no longer kept its keepers at a distance. The clay mug, cracked but whole, fit into Rosa's hand as if it had been made for the particular geography of her fingers. It warmed her and reminded her of a truth she had always practiced. Dignity is not a single thing, but a web of practices. When the town asked how such a change had been possible, the simplest answer was this: the law had done its narrow work of naming and record, but the real repair was the daily choice to act otherwise. Apology without change would have been a sound in empty air. The notary's reading had opened a door,
the people chose to walk through it together and to bring buckets and nails and books. There were evenings when Rosa would sit by the fogan and listen to the house breathe. Children would tumble past, singing a fragment of a song learned in the classroom. Valentina would sometimes be at the ledger table, discussing planting schedules. Esteban would bring news of a repaired ox harness. Lupita would hum as she kneaded dough.
The commissario would swing by to check the municipal posting and nod with the discreet approval of one who likes to see his town less troubled. Rosa thought about the clay mug and its hairline crack. The crack had not been repaired. It had been kept as a memory of small accidents and ongoing usefulness. She liked that it held the light of morning in its fissure. The photograph and the mug had been small tokens. They had become anchors for a life that had been found again, not by vengeance, but by practice. In the end, the restitution that mattered was not an extravagant gift, but a series of ordinary promises kept. Names entered in a ledger, a child's fever treated in time, a bed mended before a leaf-blown night, a class where a little girl learned to trace her name and recognized herself in ink. Those things did not erase the sting of exile, but they reshaped the future. On a quiet morning, with the house around her awake in a new way, Rosa set the mug on the sill and placed the photograph beside it. Steam rose and blurred Don Rafael's face into the light as it always had, and for a moment she felt the convergence of past and present in a small domestic altar. She thought of how law and labor had met. One had given her name, the other had given her voice. Both were necessary. If you believe dignity should be defended, share this story. Would you have forgiven